Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. Today we're diving deep into, well, a grape.
A grape.
Maybe not the flashiest grape out there,
Right.
but we're all about going beyond those big names everyone talks about. And
Yeah.
you sent over just a ton of info on Trebbiano.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot to cover.
So we've got its whole history, how it's grown, what winemakers do with it, the whole 9 yards. Our mission today,
Right.
we're going to take this grape. I mean, it's kind of the unsung hero in a lot of wines, and we're going to really see what makes it tick, how it became so important,
Yeah.
and, all the different faces it can have in a bottle.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is right off the bat, just how much Trebbiano is out there, especially in Italy. Maybe it's not like bursting with aromas like some other white grapes, but it's a workhorse.
Yeah.
It's the backbone of a whole lot of wine.
Yeah, it seems like it really is. I was looking at the materials you sent over, and I mean, the historical significance of this grape in Italian winemaking is just huge.
Huge. Yeah.
And, it's got this global reach, too, that I think would probably surprise a lot of people. Like, there's some pretty good evidence out there that it might go all the way back to the Romans,
Oh, wow.
possibly even linked to this grape called Trebbianum. I
Mm.
don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
Sounds good to me.
But here's something that really stood out to me. It's one of Italy's, if not the most planted white grape varieties.
Yes, right.
I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
The sheer volume of wine that relies on this grape.
Absolutely. It's remarkable, especially when you consider how adaptable it is. It thrives in all sorts of Italian regions, each with its own way of doing things when it comes to winemaking.
Yeah, and each one making different styles of wine, too. Yeah. I mean, given how much of it they grow, it must be pretty important to the Italian wine industry, right?
Yeah.
And, I mean, historically speaking, was it always kind of a blending grape? Did they use it to kind of prop up other wines?
You're hitting the nail on the head. It's widespread planting. It really speaks to Trebbiano's reliability. It consistently produces a good amount of grapes. And historically, that was super valuable, especially for blending. Winemakers would use it essentially as the base for a lot of their traditional white wines.
Mm-hmm.
It gave them that structure, the acidity that a lot of other, maybe more fragrant grapes sometimes lacked. And that reliability, that's a big deal. It played a huge role in, well, shaping how Italian wine developed over centuries.
Okay, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
It's the solid foundation you can build on.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of its adaptable nature, let's dive into, like, the basics of Trebbiano, just the grape itself. You mentioned ampelographically speaking at one point.
Right.
Now, for someone who's not, deep in the world of viticulture, what exactly does that mean? Like, what are we looking at when we're talking about that?
So ampelography, it's basically like grapevine detective work. It's all about identifying and categorizing different types of vines based on what they look like. Their leaves, their grapes, you name it. And when we talk about Trebbiano in ampelographic terms, well, we're talking about vines with these kind of medium to large leaves, most of them having either 5 lobes, like a hand, or even just 3, giving them almost a pentagon shape.
Interesting.
They're great bunches. They tend to be, well, medium to large again, mostly cone-shaped, or maybe a bit longer, kind of like a cylinder. And the berries, those are the individual grapes. They're medium-sized, kind of oval, and they have this distinct greenish-yellow color. One thing to note, their skin is pretty thin.
Okay, so thin skin, does that mean they're more delicate, more likely to have problems when they're still growing on the vine?
It's true. Thin skins can make the grapes a bit more susceptible to, say, fungal diseases or damage. But it's a trade-off because that same thin skin, it's actually part of what makes a lot of Trebbiano wines so fresh. You get that lighter-bodied character. And another interesting thing about Trebbiano, it doesn't follow the typical schedule. It tends to bud kind of late in the spring, and it takes its time ripening, well into autumn.
Oh, okay.
Now, the late budding, that's a good thing in places that get late frosts, protects those young bugs. But it also means growers need to make sure the grapes have enough time to get fully ripe, especially if the climate's on the cooler side.
So it's like a balancing act for them.
Absolutely.
The sources you sent over, they also mentioned that Trebbiano is known for being a high-yielding grape. Is that, like, a good thing generally? Or does that create its own set of problems?
High productivity, that's a real hallmark of Trebbiano. It's been a big part of its popularity historically. But you're right to question it. Like, it's not as simple as just more grapes, better wine. If you let the vines go crazy and produce way too much, the flavors in the grapes get diluted. It's like spreading the flavor too thin.
Right, right.
So to keep things balanced and make sure the grapes have really good flavor, growers use different techniques, like pruning, which is cutting back the vines in specific ways, and they manage the canopy, which means making sure the leaves and branches are arranged so that sunlight and air can get to all the grapes.
Okay, so it's all about quality, not just quantity.
Exactly. Quality over quantity, always.
Now, let's talk about what happens when those grapes finally make it to the winery.
All right.
Because your sources really highlighted what they called Trebbiano's enological potential, which that sounds pretty fancy.
It does, doesn't it?
But they basically pointed out that it has high acidity and a more, I guess, neutral to delicate aroma.
Uh-huh.
Why are those two things so important when you're making wine?
It's fascinating because those two seemingly simple things, they're the secret weapons that make Trebbiano so incredibly versatile. The high acidity,
I
it's
know.
like the magic ingredient for a really fresh, vibrant wine. It's what gives it that zing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's essential for sparkling wines, too. It creates that lift, that energy that makes them sparkle.
Makes sense.
And even in the dry white wines, those that are made to be a little more serious, the acidity is what keeps everything in balance.
Mm.
It can even help the wine age better. Now, the aroma, yeah, it's not like bursting with tropical fruits or anything, but that's actually a strength in disguise.
Oh, interesting.
It allows something called terroir to shine through.
Terroir.
Terroir, it's like the personality of the place where the grapes are grown. It's the climate, the soil, everything. And when you've got a grape that's not shouting its own aromas, the terroir can really express itself. And when you're really careful with how you make the wine gentle with the grapes, careful with the temperature, Trebbiano can make these dry white wines that are, well, they might be subtle, but they're incredibly appealing.
Hmm.
And they really tell the story of where they come from.
You also mentioned that they use Trebbiano for sweet wines, like Vinsanto.
Oh, absolutely.
So how does that neutral profile work with something that's, well, sweet?
It's all about balance. For Vinsanto, they often dry the grapes first. So you're concentrating the sugars, but you're concentrating the acids too. And Trebbiano's natural acidity is high, right? So it stops the wine from being too sweet, too cloying.
Makes sense.
Keeps it refreshing. And those subtle aromas we talked about, well, the drying and aging process, it kind of unlocks them. You get these intense aromas of dried fruit, nuts, honey. It's really fascinating.
Wow. Okay, you've definitely got me seeing Trebbiano in a whole new light here.
Good.
So where do we go from here? Like, what's the plan for really getting to know this grape?
Well, we're going to go deep. We'll start with the origins, trace its history back through time.
Okay.
Then we'll look at how the terroir, the specific place, shapes Trebbiano in different parts of Italy. We're talking Abruzzo, Lazio, Umbria, Tuscany, Emilia-Romagna.
Wow. We've got a lot of ground to cover.
After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how it's grown and how winemakers work their magic. And of course, we have to taste the wines.
Of course.
From those crisp, refreshing dry whites to the bubbly stuff. And then, of course, those lovely sweet wines like Vinsanto.
All right, I'm ready.
And then we'll finish up by looking at what challenges Trebbiano faces these days and what its future might look like.
Perfect. So let's start at the very beginning. The origins, the history of Trebbiano. I mean, you mentioned there might be a connection to the Romans. What do we really know about its early days?
Right. So it looks like Trebbiano probably got its start somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. And there's this really strong possibility that we don't have genetic proof yet that it's related to a Roman grape called Trebbianum.
Trebbianum.
They actually mention this grape in some ancient Roman writings.
Oh, wow.
And the name Trebbiano itself probably comes from some Latin terms, maybe referring to a specific place or even like a certain type of wine they made back then.
Fascinating.
But what's really amazing is that Trebbiano has been a part of Italian viticulture for so long.
Mm-hmm.
It's been there since the Romans, through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. It's always been there. And that really shows how adaptable it is.
Yeah.
It clearly did well across the whole Italian peninsula.
That is incredible. To think about one grape variety having such a continuous history.
It really is.
But, and this is something that kind of blew my mind, its story doesn't just stay in Italy.
Oh, no, not at all. It ventured out into the world. Most notably, it went to France, where it goes by the name Uni Blanc. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Uni Blanc is the main grape they use to make cognac
Wow.
and Armagnac.
And Armagnac.
two of the most famous spirits in the world. So, it's not just about table wine.
Right, right.
It can be the base for some pretty high-end stuff.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
You find it in other places too, like Australia, Argentina, even the US.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not as dominant as in Italy, of course.
So from these ancient Roman vineyards to being the base for some of the world's most famous spirits, that's quite a journey.
It really is.
Now, I'm curious, how has the way we cultivate Trebbiano changed over time? I mean, we're talking centuries here.
The way we grow Trebbiano has undergone a real revolution. We've gone from those old school methods, where it was all about getting as many grapes as possible, to a much more modern approach. Now it's all about quality and controlling how much the vines produce. We've got all sorts of techniques now, like clonal selection, where we pick specific versions of the vine that have the best traits.
Okay.
Then there's using the right rootstocks, the part of the vine that's underground, matching them to the soil. And then, of course, there are the training systems.
Training systems.
How we actually shape and guide the vines in the vineyard.
Interesting.
All of this has made a huge difference in the quality of the grapes we get from Trebbiano.
And what about the winemaking itself? I mean, how has that evolved over the years?
Similar story. Really, it's come a long way. In the old days, Trebbiano was mostly used for pretty simple, dry, white wines. But as time went on, winemakers started to experiment. They realized, hey, we can use this for other things too.
Like what?
Well, like Vinsanto, as we mentioned, they even started making sparkling wines with it.
Okay.
And more recently, there's been a real shift towards, trying to make Trebbiano more complex. So they've started using oak barrels to ferment and age it. And something called lees aging is becoming popular, where they leave the wine in contact with the dead yeast cells after fermentation. It adds a creamy texture and some interesting flavors. But what's really cool is that they've rediscovered Trebbiano's neutral character as a good thing. Like we talked about, it lets the terroir, the personality of the place, really shine through in the wine.
It's almost like they're working with the grape now instead of trying to force it to be something else.
Yeah, exactly. It's about letting Trebbiano be Trebbiano, and when you do that, you can make some really special wines.
Now, we've been saying Trebbiano this whole time, but the sources you sent over mentioned that it has like a whole bunch of different names.
Oh, yeah, a whole bunch. Because it's been grown in so many different places for so long, it's picked up all these local names. Just in Italy, you might see it called Trebbiano Toscano, Trebbiano Romagnolo, Trebbiano d'Abruzzo, Trebbiano Spoletino, Trebbiano Giallo, or even Biancame, especially in the Marche region. And then, of course, in France, it's mostly known as Ugni Blanc.
Wow, that is a lot of names.
It's like it has a secret identity in every region.
It really does. And are there any other grapes that are like related to Trebbiano or sometimes mistaken for it?
There are a few. There's one called Procanico, which is basically Trebbiano Toscano, but with a different name in the Orvieto region.
Orvieto.
And some people think it's actually its own distinct grape, even though it's so similar.
Interesting.
And then there's Claret, a grape mostly found in the southern Rhone in France. We're not 100% sure if it's genetically linked to Trebbiano, but there's a good chance it is.
Okay, so it's like a whole family tree of names and grapes.
Exactly.
All right, so now we've got a good idea of where Trebbiano comes from, how it's grown, and all its different aliases.
Right.
Let's talk about terroir, which we touched on earlier. How the place where it's grown really shapes the wine. And you mentioned 5 key regions in Italy.
Yeah.
Let's start with Abruzzo. What makes it so special for Trebbiano?
Abruzzo is on the Adriatic coast, and it's got this interesting mix of continental climate, with cold winters, and a bit of maritime influence from the sea, so the summers are warm and dry. And the soil, mostly calcareous, meaning it has lots of calcium carbonate and clay. You find a lot of these vineyards up on the slopes of the mountains there. And all of that together gives you Trebbiano d'Abruzzo, which has really high acidity. It makes the wine super refreshing.
Nice.
You often get these lovely aromas of like pear and citrus fruit and a really distinct minerality. You can really taste the soil in the wine.
Wow, so the terroir really comes through.
It really does. And the Trebbiano d'Abruzzo DOC, that's the official designation for the wines from that region, they're a great example of that.
Okay, so that's Abruzzo. What about Lazio, the region around Rome? How does Trebbiano express itself there?
Lazio is classic Mediterranean climate. Hot, dry summers, mild, wet winters. And here's the interesting part. You get a lot of different soil types there. Volcanic soils, clay soils, even this porous rock called tuff. And that mix of soils makes the Trebbiano wines a bit more well, rounder, with riper fruit aromas,
Like what?
like peach, apricot, sometimes even floral and herbal notes.
Huh?
The Trebbiano di Frascati wines, those are typical of Lazio.
Right. And then there's Umbria.
Right, Umbria. It's inland, so it's more continental than Lazio, meaning it's a little cooler overall.
Okay.
But it's got hills and valleys, so you get all these little microclimates. And the soils there are a mix of clay, limestone, and some volcanic tuff, too. So the Trebbiano from Umbria, especially the Trebbiano Spoletino, has good acidity, often with those citrus notes, but the minerality is more pronounced.
More pronounced, okay.
And there's this DOC called Trebbiano Spoletino DOC, and these wines are known for being really aromatic and complex.
So that's 3 regions down. 2 to go. What about Tuscany? I mean, everyone knows Tuscany for its red wines.
Oh, no,
So
absolutely.
where does Trebbiano fit in there?
Well, Tuscany is mostly Mediterranean climate, but it changes a lot depending on how close you are to the coast, how high up you are, things like that.
Right.
And the soils are all over the place. You've got clay, limestone, sandstone, even this flaky schist called galestro.
Listro.
So because of all that variety, you get all sorts of different Trebbiano wines in Tuscany.
Okay.
Some are light and fruity, but it's also really important for their Vinsanto, you know, the sweet wines we talked about.
Yeah.
Trebbiano gives them those complex dried fruit, nut, and honey flavors.
So even in a region known for reds, Trebbiano still finds a way to shine.
It does, it does. And in Tuscany, they usually call it Trebbiano Toscano.
Okay, last but not least, we have Emilia-Romagna.
Emilia-Romagna, that's a big region stretching across northern Italy. The climate goes from continental in the west to more temperate near the Adriatic Sea in the east. And the soils, oh, they're a real mix. Clay, sand, limestone, alluvial deposits.
Alluvial deposit.
So yeah, lots of variation there. And because of that, the Trebbiano Romagnolo wines, those are the ones from that region, they can be pretty different depending on where exactly the grapes are grown. But overall, they tend to be light, easy drinking wines.
So climate and soil play a huge role. Can we generalize at all about the impact of climate on Trebbiano?
Yeah, you can definitely see some trends. Cooler regions usually mean higher acidity in the wines, and the fruit aromas are more delicate, like green apple or lemon. Warmer regions, the wines have more body, and the fruit flavors are riper. Think peach or apricot. And something that's super important is something called diurnal temperature variation.
Diurnal, right.
That's just a fancy way of saying the difference between the daytime and nighttime temperature.
I've heard of that.
If there's a big difference, like hot days and cool nights, the grapes develop more complex aromas, and the wines are fresher because the cool nights help preserve the acidity.
So the climate's not just about how hot or cold it gets.
Exactly. It's about the whole picture.
Okay, and what about soil? You've mentioned a few different types. Is there a general way that soil impacts Trebbiano?
Soil is super important. It's like the foundation of the wine. Calcareous soils, remember those are the ones with lots of calcium carbonate. They often give you wines with more minerality and higher acidity. Volcanic soils, those are the ones we talked about in Lazio and Umbria. They can give you these really interesting mineral notes, and they add to the complexity of the aromas.
Okay.
Clay soils usually mean the wines have more body, they feel a bit heavier in your mouth, and sandy soils often make for lighter, fruitier wines.
Interesting. So if a grower wants to make a specific style of Trebbiano, what kind of terroir are they looking for?
Well, it depends on the style they're after, but generally a moderate climate is best, you know, not too hot, not too cold. That way the grapes can ripen slowly and evenly. Well, draining soils are also important, especially those with a good mix of calcareous and clay limestone. And in warmer places, higher altitudes can help because it's cooler up there and you get that good diurnal variation we talked about.
The difference between day and night temperatures.
Exactly. And of course you need enough sunlight, but not too much. You want the grapes to ripen fully, but you don't want them to get sunburned.
It's a lot to balance.
It is. It is.
Can you give some examples of how this all works out in practice, like with those DOCs we mentioned earlier?
Absolutely. Let's take Trebbiano d'Abruzzo DOC. Remember, it's from Abruzzo on the Adriatic coast.
Yeah.
The cool climate in calcareous soils, they give you those fresh mineral wines we talked about. Then you've got Frascati DOC from Lazio. That's where the volcanic soils give you lighter, fruitier wines with that characteristic minerality.
Okay.
Then there's Trebbiano Spoletino DOC in Umbria, which is known for being really aromatic and complex because of the mix of soils and all those little microclimates.
Right.
And in Tuscany, you've got Vinsanto, which is made with Trebbiano Toscano. It's those specific drying techniques in the Tuscan climate that create those concentrated flavors of dried fruit and honey.
Yeah.
And finally, you have Trebbiano Romagnolo DOC from Emilia-Romagna. Those are the lighter, easy-drinking wines, and they really reflect all the different climates and soils you find in that region.
It's amazing how the same grape can be so different depending on where it's grown.
It really is a testament to its versatility.
Now, let's get really close up on the Trebbiano vine itself. Like, what does it look like? What are the key things that define it?
Okay, imagine you're standing right in front of a Trebbiano vine. You'd see these medium to large leaves, usually with 3 to 5 lobes. Those
Yeah.
are the sections of the leaf.
Right, right.
They're often kind of pentagonal, almost circular in shape. The bunches of grapes themselves are also pretty big,
Yeah.
either cone-shaped or more cylindrical. And as we talked about before, the berries, those are the individual grapes. They're medium-sized, a bit oval with that greenish-yellow color, and they have that thin skin. One thing that's kind of cool, if you touch the top of a Trebbiano leaf, it feels a bit rough.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and you might see some fine whitish hairs on the underside.
I never knew that.
These details are how viticulturists, the grapevine experts, can tell it's a Trebbiano vine. But for the average person, the takeaway is that these are some strong vines when they're taken care of properly.
Okay, so we've got the looks down. What about its life cycle? We talked about late budding and ripening. Can you walk us through what happens throughout the year?
Absolutely. So it all starts with that late budding, which, like we discussed, it's a good thing in places where there are late frosts because it protects those fragile buds.
Yeah.
About 6 to 8 weeks after bud break, the flowers start to appear. This is a crucial time for the vine because if the weather's bad, like cold and rainy, it can mess up the pollination process.
Pollination.
That's how the flowers get fertilized to produce grapes.
Right, right.
If pollination doesn't go well, you can get problems like millerandage.
Millerandage.
That's where you get grapes of all different sizes in a bunch, and they might not ripen at the same time. Or you can even get couleur.
Couleur.
That's when the flowers or the tiny baby grapes just don't develop at all.
Oh, so good.
Not good at all. But if everything goes well, the berries start growing, and then we get to veraison.
Veraison.
That's when the grapes change color.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
It's a sign that they're starting to ripen. And for Trebbiano, ripening is usually a slow and steady process, which is why winemakers have to be really careful about the balance of sugar and acid in the grapes.
So it's a bit like watching a pot, waiting for it to boil. You can't rush it.
Exactly. And finally, when it's time to harvest, that depends on what kind of wine the winemaker wants to make.
Okay.
If they want a really fresh, acidic wine, they'll pick the grapes earlier. Same thing for sparkling wines. But if they want a wine with more body, maybe for brandy, they'll wait longer to harvest.
So it's a whole season of careful observation and decision-making.
It really is.
Now, let's talk about how growers actually manage these Trebbiano vines. You mentioned pruning earlier. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, pruning is super important for Trebbiano because remember, it's a very vigorous vine.
Right.
It wants to grow like crazy.
It needs some discipline.
Exactly. So one way to control it is through short pruning.
Short pruning.
So that's where you leave fewer buds on the vine so it produces fewer grapes. But the ones it does produce have more concentrated flavor.
Right.
If the grower wants more grapes, they can do longer pruning, but they have to be careful not to let the quality suffer.
Right. Quality over quantity.
Always. And there are different ways to train the vines, too, like the Goyo system, where you have 1 or 2 main canes that get pruned back each year.
Okay.
Or the cordon spur system, where you have permanent arms on the vine with short spurs that produce the grapes.
Interesting. So it's not just about cutting back the vine, it's about shaping it too.
Exactly. Shaping and guiding it to grow in a way that produces the best possible grapes.
So what other things do growers need to worry about besides pruning?
Well, canopy management is really important.
Canopy management.
That means managing the leaves and branches to make sure the grapes get enough sunlight and air.
Okay.
They do things like desuckering, which is removing extra shoots that don't produce grapes, and they might remove some leaves around the grape bunches too.
And why is that?
It helps the grapes ripen evenly, and good airflow helps prevent diseases, especially fungal diseases.
Makes sense.
Another key thing is yield control.
Yield control.
That means making sure the vine doesn't produce too many grapes. Remember, we want quality, not just quantity.
Right.
So they might do something called green harvesting.
Green harvesting.
That's where they actually cut off some of the grape bunches early in the season to focus the vine's energy on the remaining grapes. They can even thin out the grapes in a bunch to make the remaining grapes bigger and better.
Okay.
And then there's disease control. Trebbiano can be prone to diseases, especially mildew and rot, so growers have to be really vigilant. They use preventative measures like those pruning and canopy management techniques we talked about to make sure there's good air circulation.
Right.
And if necessary, they'll use treatments to protect the vines. And in dry areas, irrigation is essential. That means giving the vines water so they don't get stressed out.
Irrigation, okay.
It's all about keeping the vines happy and healthy so they can produce the best possible fruit.
Sounds like it takes a lot of work.
It does, but the results are worth it.
You also mentioned earlier that they use different training systems for Trebbiano. How does that work, and how does it affect the grapes?
The training system is how you guide the vine as it grows. Different systems change how much sunlight the grapes get, how much air circulates around them, and that all affects how many grapes the vine produces and how good they are. One system is called spalliera. It's also called vertical shoot positioning.